Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Alexa, and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Evan Friss and Banta with us tonight to celebrate the Bookshop. Please walk. Before we get started, I wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's event is going to go. We'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so you can start thinking of some questions now. And then after the talk tonight, Evan will be signing and personalizing books at the table next to where you guys checked in, and we'll let you know where to line up for that at the end of the event. And if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of the Bookshop online using the link in the live stream description. The Bookshop is an affectionate history of the American bookstore and its central place in American culture. It is a love letter to bookstores, one I'm sure we'd all co-sign, an essential reading to understand how these vital institutions have shaped American life, and of course, why we still need them. Evan Friss is a professor of history at James Madison University and the author of 2 other books, The Cycling City, Bicycles in the Urban America in the 1890s. Sorry.
Same difference.
Yeah. And On Bicycles, a 200-year history of cycling in New York City. He lives with his wife, a bookseller, and 2 children, occasional booksellers in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And Banta is a writer and the marketing events coordinator and indie bookseller here at Books Are Magic. Her debut novel, Honey, was an Indie Next Pick, Good Morning America Buzz Pick, and a Book of the Month pick. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Evan and Belle. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're
here.
so happy to have you.
Yeah, so I thought I'd start with a very short reading from the book. Just imagine we're 7/10 of a mile away from here on Smith Street, just southeast in another Books Are Magic. In 2017, Emma Straub and her husband Michael opened a bookstore in the Cobble Hill section of Brooklyn. They were both book savvy. Emma knew how to write them, Michael knew how to design them. As it turned out, they also knew how to run a bookstore, especially in the age of social media. It started with the name, Books Are Magic. It was genius. That books and bookstores are magic is a given, at least among the core demographic. Buying a Books Are Magic hoodie reflects a love of more than just the 1,800 square foot bookstore. It's also a public pronouncement of one's love of reading. So is posting a photograph of a bookstore, a tower of books, or a hardcover, croissant, and mug grouped together in a tempting tableau. On Instagram alone, there have been more than 100 billion posts tagged with Bookstagram. On TikTok, BookTok videos have garnered billions of views. While sidewalk bookstores, the most visible variety, have mostly disappeared, people gawk at screens saturated with books. Perhaps there's no more fitting Bookstagram selfie than the one taken standing in front of the original Books Are Magic, a second location, opened in 2022. Along Butler Street is the windowless Instagram wall. The background is all black, in large white print, and as if beamed in pink light a la the bat signal is the store's name, Books Are Magic. It's the perfect scale. When regular-size adults pose, the letters are directly over their heads. They look like reading superheroes. Inside the just right level of crowded shop is a mix of wood and brick, a skylight, some industrial lighting, and a few homespun touches. Over in the New York section, I noticed one of my previous books. I was smitten, but it wasn't just me. I was browsing with a friend, a wise psychologist who carefully moderates her coffee intake. She was similarly charmed by the in real life experience, as were tourists, some of whom came for the wall, and regulars who chatted with friendly booksellers. A 30-something bought what seemed like every book from the New York section, except mine. A couple in the corner giggled as they twirled a rack of cards. Happy Hanukkah to everyone but Jeff Bezos. Toward the back was the kids section. I couldn't resist. I left with 2 tie-dyed Books Are Magic t-shirts.
I love that. And this is my copy. Did you see the heart I drew next to this section?
I did.
I was like, oh, I work there. It's so great. Yeah, there is, as we can all see, there is kind of a type of magic in here. I think it owes a lot just to the design of it and just the space in general, how light it feels. But this book was so wonderful just and very close to my heart. Because I know your previous books were not about book selling or books at all. What prompted this one? What was the seed of it?
Amanda, who's somewhere here, that person right there, who had an 8.5-year tenure at 3 Lives and Company over in the West Village of Manhattan. And I was in grad school studying American history, and it was really through her experience and me visiting her and me listening to her talk about the bookstore that I came to appreciate just how special and important these institutions can be. And as a historian, we pride ourselves on asking why. How did these institutions come to be? How long have there been bookstores in America? What were some of the first bookstores like? How have they evolved over time? Why are some still here? These were all sort of questions floating around my head, and I decided many years ago that I wanted to write this book. And a couple of other books got in the way, and some children, and most shockingly, this book hadn't been written yet, and I kept sort of waiting for somebody else to do it, and thankfully for me anyway, that didn't happen. So the timing was right, and from Amanda's experience, sort of, ignited the idea. And then once I had this concept, spent many years researching in archives and libraries and also in bookstores.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of my favorite parts of this book is the amount of people you talk to. Like, you go all over the country, you're talking to a lot of different booksellers. I mean, are there, where was kind of the most out there place you went, or who did you talk to that kind of blew your mind?
Everywhere we happened to go for fun or work, I tried to stop at as many bookstores as possible. The one that maybe blew my mind, and he died yesterday, was Len Riggio, the founder, or the man who made Barnes & Noble into a national name. And this was thanks to my editor, Rick, who I spot over there, who somehow told somebody who told somebody who told somebody who told Len that I was a friend or a good person. I don't know. But I was allowed to spend an afternoon with Len Riggio in his office, which is more like an art gallery. And I think he thought I was actually friends with somebody that I wasn't, but I didn't say anything. And he was just so excited. And he showed me all of his art and telling me all these stories. And I said, okay, but I'm here for an interview, And he was really gracious and offered a lot of his time. And I'm not used to conversing with billionaires, so that was pretty out there.
Wow, yeah.
But also just some of his stories, he just casually mentioned how he casually offered to buy Amazon over a steak dinner with Jeff Bezos.
Yes, I remember that.
And he just said it as sort of, as a matter of fact. And
do you think Jeff should have sold?
No, I say in the book that of course he shouldn't have. And Len Riggio, to his credit, said that Jeff Bezos was way too smart to sell it to like an idiot like him. That's what he said. I didn't quote that in the book.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of praise for Bezos's, at least, genius in certain respects, but said if I had bought the company, it would never have amounted to what it turned out to be.
Yeah. I feel like for me, as I was reading, this kind of theme that I thought was interesting was like this, you talk about it, I think you say there's like salesmanship versus like bookmanship. And I really thought that was fascinating, just working at a store myself. And I think when I think of Amazon, I do like a lot of the, customer data, it's all algorithm based, and versus bookselling does feel more personable. It feels like the hand sell, I think, is such kind of a sacred thing, and so determinant on personality and community. I mean, can you talk more about that? Because that really, in every section that came through to me, like kind of the style of book selling from Gotham to Barnes Noble to Amazon, like kind of there seemed to me to be different percentages of like, is this a business that needs to have a profit and then you have Jeff Bezos, or is this like, we're gonna, make this, more about activism and community? It did seem to me that there was like always those questions coming up.
So Amazon has done some remarkable things for publishing and book selling, and as I write about in the book, many parts of the country have long been bookstore deserts and remain so today. So democratizing access to books, democratizing publishing. Anybody can self-publish a book and people can get books delivered to them anywhere across the world. So that, while that's noted, yes, there's something very different that happens in a store like this than on Amazon. And although some of the data can be a bit hard to read, it's very clear that if you walk into this bookstore, you are much more, maybe it's 2 times more, 3 times more, 10 times more, but much more likely to leave with a book that you didn't expect to buy or that you had never heard of than on Amazon. And part of what so many of us appreciate about coming to bookstores is discoverability, the kind of serendipity of talking to a bookseller, reading a note, a shelf talker, finding something that you wouldn't have found otherwise. And part of the randomness almost is the excitement. I'm reading this essay collection now by Elisa Gabbert. Amanda told me to read it. Something about the only self. What? Any person is the only self, yes. It's out in paperback now. Really good. And the first essay is about how she likes to go to the she did like to go to the library, and she would look at the books that had just been returned. And it was a kind of miscellany. And that brought her a lot of joy. And that really resonated with me.
I love that.
And we as humans love randomness. If you have a neighbor that you don't really like that much, and you're in China and you see this neighbor, they're like your best friend all of a sudden, right? Because it's the random, you go out to dinner with, you never talk to them, but there's this weird, it feels joyous, the randomness of finding it. And I think finding the perfect book, walking into a bookstore, overhearing somebody talk about a book, or have a bookseller tell you, or having some weird author standing there and you're like, all right, I'll buy this book, this guy's here. Can be just delightful experiences. And that's not the same as buying a book online.
Yeah, I literally wrote down that quote where it's customers expect to be told the books they wanted weren't actually the books they wanted.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, because I feel like working here too, I often feel like the algorithm of what a reader is. I feel like it's so much more varied than maybe even publishers would expect. Like I see that so much more on the ground where it's like, you'd think, oh, this is like a literary fiction reader, but I've hand-sold so much fantasy to those people randomly, and they're like, okay, I'm down, because maybe they're reading the next romantasy trend now and they're more willing to try it. But I think readers in general are more variable and more willing to try things than you'd expect. I mean, I just look at my coworkers now. I just read my first thriller. I never read thrillers, but I just wanted to be able to recommend something to someone, and my coworker gave me something to read, and I really liked it. And now I'm like, okay, I guess I'm a thriller reader now too. And I feel like you can just expand upon yourself constantly.
Yeah. I think it's a relationship that goes both ways. So booksellers learn from their customers who come in and tell them about books that they haven't read or maybe even haven't heard about. And there's this relationship that can be mutually beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of in the chapter, one of the most interesting chapters, I think, when you all read the book, is the one on Amazon where it talks about Amazon's retail bookshops. And I think, because they did have customer reviews on their shelves, but I feel like to me it's so different from having like these shelf talkers, right?
And we're so used to the Amazon universe, it kind of just, it reads very differently than these note cards from individual booksellers who are human. Now, the people who review things on Amazon are supposedly human too. But, if you went into one of those stores, yeah, it would say average 4.6 rating, and there would be some quote from, Judy from Des Moines, and you're like, well, who is Judy from Des Moines? And we may not know who Eric is, or David, or Bex, or I can hardly read these, but they do have the authority and respect of this institution that you all have helped create, that we come here and know that this is a great bookstore and can kind of trust it. And some of the particular reviews that they chose to use were also just weird sometimes. As were some of the section titles I write in the book. My favorite one, there was a bay of books. This was in the Bethesda Amazon Books store, where it said, "If you like nonfiction." And it was a series of nonfiction books. And I thought the "if you like" was a bit superfluous.
Yeah.
And stretched.
That should have been a fiction section.
Yeah.
Fiction for if you like nonfiction.
But that's sort of like, I think, got at the essence of what Amazon is. It's just a little inhuman. It's almost, it's like some of the stuff read like it was translated, or it was spit out by ChatGPT or something, and I'm not saying it was, but it was just a little less personal and a little less human and a little less real than a shop like this.
Yeah, definitely. It's like scale. I feel like you talked also about scale versus kind of like, a store like this, which is quite small, but you get the human interaction. I did want to talk a little bit about the Strand, because I really liked that chapter too. And something you said really interested me, which was, and kind of even I think about this with the Bookstore Magic Wall too, it's like, does a bookstore kind of become a bit of a tourist attraction sometimes? I mean, especially in a place like New York, I think the Strand is somewhere that people kind of have on their checklist to go in New York. It's become that huge, and the merch is really popular. Merch here is also very popular. But I think, what do you think a bookstore kind of needs to succeed now? Because it seems to me like, and you say this multiple times, I think there is that part where when you talk about the online courses, and I really liked that part, because it was saying like a bookstore needs something extra besides just selling books to succeed. So like, in your opinion, because you wrote a book about it, what do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's bad for a bookstore to be a tourist attraction. That can be a reason to celebrate. And a lot of people have strong feelings about the Strand for a whole host of reasons. And people will go to Portland to see Powell's, along with 2 or 3 other kind of bucket list or checklist kind of items. In New York City, it's much the same, but there are also plenty of tourists who want to come to Bookstore Magic, and
I love it. We love it.
Yeah,
it's great.
And it's a great thing, and they go home and proudly carry around a tote bag, and
so great.
You see New Yorkers with Daunt Books tote bags, that have been to London and are proud of that. And I think, again, somewhere in the book I have a quote from Allison Hill, who's the current CEO of the American Booksellers Association, which is the trade group that most indie bookstores belong to, that she said basically indies are doing well, but they're dancing as fast as they can, and often reinventing themselves and expanding the range of offerings with merch and other kinds of sidelines. And that's very common, and you see that it's pervasive. But a couple of hours ago, I was at 3 Lives and Company, and they don't sell any mugs, they don't sell any socks, they don't have literary tours, they don't have, they do sell tote bags, but they're kind of hidden. And they basically just sell books. And they also get a lot of tourists, they don't have the same kind of fame as the Strand, and people aren't coming to New York to go see 3 Lives, but people in the know who want to see a real magical kind of bookstore go there. And so it's an anomaly, but it's also proof that it can exist.
Yeah, I've seen all these TikToks of folks who are visiting New York, and they're like, I have to go to Bookstore Magic, or I have to go to the Strand. It's so cool. I just think it's really, really cool. Like, people come here to visit, which is amazing.
And Emma is also part of, she's obviously a best-selling author, and people want to see her bookstore. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was part of a group that bought the drama Bookshop, people want to go there. So some of that has to do with, kind of celebrity and fandom, which can also be, useful. And I'm not disparaging, but as part of the attraction too, for good reason.
Yeah. Okay, so I also have to ask, well, I was going to ask if you would ever open a bookstore, but you told me before that your wife has just opened a bookstore.
Yes,
so.
I would never open a bookstore. But I would happily marry someone who would open a bookstore.
I mean, how has it, because now I feel like you have an inside look as, a writer and now as the spouse of a bookstore owner.
I know so much more than when I finished the book, because Amanda's shop opened in October, so it's relatively new. And I write in the book about my one shift as a bookseller at 3 Lives, which lasted 4 or 5 hours and was very memorable. But now I've had a lot more shifts as a bookseller, and I think I have a greater understanding for the joys and perils of the business, and have even more of an insider window. And if anything, I've only come to appreciate bookstores more. My agent might be annoyed because my wife also tells me that my book is out of stock, and then I complain to her to complain to the editor to figure out what's happening. And most authors maybe aren't so tapped in to what's happening behind the scenes.
Oh no, I always have to resist seeing how I don't even look anymore.
Yeah,
it's hard. Yeah, I think. Well, and I mean there are, you say kind of because when I was a kid. I'm curious if you had a local indie that you loved. I mean, I had one, and I remember now I'm kind of a writer and / bookseller, but I feel like writing and reading are so intertwined, and so it doesn't surprise me that Benjamin Franklin, from Anne Patchett to Emma Straub, all are these multi-hyphenate kind of bookseller, novelists, people. And I think, do you kind of see yourself in that vein now a little bit?
No, it's Amanda's bookstore, and I pick up an occasional shift there. But I do think it's useful to have some of these roles blurred. And just like I understand the bookselling business by way of Amanda, I think she has a window into what it's like to be an author, and she knows more about publishing than the typical bookseller might, especially outside of New York. So, and back when Ben Franklin was selling books, the market was so small, basically he had to do various different kind of jobs that have then been, in more modern times, separated out with, various middlemen, each taking a role, and of course each taking a cut along the way. But I love working occasionally as a bookseller, especially if the alternative is making dinner or something. But it's just, it really is, I don't want to sound corny, I don't have the right word to describe it, but it feels so pleasurable and powerful when somebody walks into a shop and they walk into and up to you and say, tell me what to read. Or I liked X, Y, and Z. What should I read next? And there's a moment of terror. And you're like, I haven't heard of X. I think Y is this book, and Z is maybe some A. I know I'm so confused. But after that moment sort of seeds, then it's really fun. And and amazingly, and I don't want to scare any of your customers about how powerful we booksellers can be, but it's amazing how often they just listen to you, you just come in, and I could just, take this book, and be like, you have to read this book.
This is the book, yeah.
And they do.
Yeah.
And then they come back, and they're like, this was a great book, and, it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, and it's not corny at all. I get very corny about working here, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm always like, I feel like I told you this, I'm looking at my coworker, Lex. I feel like I'm always like, my childhood dream is coming, that's how it feels to be in a bookstore.
Yeah.
And it that never changes, even if you see kind of, the back end of it, which obviously like it takes a lot to make a bookstore run successfully, but also it's still very magical in here, I think.
Yeah.
It always will be, to me, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said your kids also are part-time booksellers. Do you feel like, a lot of this book, there's a part that mentions kind of booksellers who have risen up through, their families. I believe the McNally, you talk about McNally
Sarah
Jackson.
McNally.
Yeah. Do you think they'll be going into the family business?
I doubt it, but yeah, the Strand, which is of course this juggernaut, is a family business, and Nancy Bass Wyden, the current owner, is a third generation Bass of that shop, and Sarah McNally, and there are many others, but most of the time, bookstore kids rightly run away from the business, and our kids, I think, enjoy being surrounded by books, having access to books. Sometimes people will come in and ask them for recommendations, say, I have a nephew about your size, what should they read?
Yeah.
And that's fun, and I think they enjoy that. I'm not sure that they realize how lucky they are to grow up in a bookstore, but that has more to do with childhood psychology than anything
Right.
else. I think one day they'll reflect on that and be really grateful that their mother opened this bookshop, and it also, by opening it in this relatively small town, Amanda's a kind of pillar of the community that people know you're the
Yeah.
person who opened the bookstore, and so they have some fame and cred in the elementary and middle school hallways.
I love that. I love that so much. Well, is your childhood bookstore still around, or?
It is. It's a Barnes and Noble in a shopping center.
Okay.
I grew up in suburban Baltimore, a town called Columbia, Maryland, and I can't remember there ever being an indie bookstore around. So in our sort of local village center, at one point there was a Crown Books, which were popular along with B. Dalton and Walden Books in that era, in the 80s and early 90s. And then a Barnes and Noble opened, and that was what I understood bookstores to be, and I enjoyed it. I wouldn't frequent it and didn't hang out there. Amanda was more of a Barnes and Noble regular, and sometimes I would go there just to be close to her. But for the most part, it didn't resonate. It didn't sort of leave that much of an impression on me. I kind of liked it, and it really wasn't until after college and I was in graduate school and living here in New York that I came to experience firsthand indie bookstores and what they were like and how they were different.
Yeah. My last question's a little silly. Do you prefer, because someone in the book won't stock paperbacks, because I feel like there is kind of this journey, which is really interesting, about books kind of being more of these luxury products to then paperbacks more, I think you said in the 50s, kind of growing. What do you prefer?
I don't discriminate, I guess. There's something exciting about a hardcover. A lot of books now come out paperback only, and I'm proud to have a hardback for a while, and hope it lasts for a while. There's, a nice heft to that. But I do think the sort of question gets at something interesting, which is, the bookstores can be, and have historically been, at least in some context, elitist spaces that weren't always welcoming and that could be intimidating to enter, and that wouldn't carry, paperbacks, wouldn't carry a lot of genres. And even over the course of my lifetime, what we would think of as kind of higher end literary indies, I think have started to stock a much broader selection. And so whatever kind of, pretentiousness existed and elitism, I wouldn't say it's disappeared entirely, but I think indie booksellers have done a much better job about opening their arms and welcoming a diverse group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We'll switch to some audience Q&A now. If anyone has a question for Evan. Yeah.
I find it amazing that I can walk to 3 bookstores from where I live, which is a block away from here. And, I really thought gonna disappear. So do you think that, young people are still reading to an extent that you didn't expect, or that, or what accounts for this sort of little, I won't say golden age, but this nice period I'm living in Brooklyn?
I'm going to repeat it real quickly for them. Just for the live stream, the question was, does Evan think that young folks are reading and visiting indie bookstores and
Yeah, so as a historian, not a cheerleader, it's, I do feel it's worth noting that there are many fewer bookstores today than there were 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and on a per capita basis than there were, 100 years ago and 150 years ago. There has been a recent resurgence, or at least stabilization, in the brick and mortar bookselling landscape, which I think is worth celebrating. And in certain places, and you happen to live in this mecca of bookstores, and you should, take full advantage of that, and you're here, so welcome. But there are a lot of other places around the country where that's not the case, and there was a Borders, and it left in 1999 or 2003, and it hasn't been replaced. So I think it's a kind of, there are mixed signals and lots of reasons to be optimistic. The steady decline that seemed so devastating and seemed so permanent turned out to maybe not be permanent. But it also seems hard to imagine sort of returning to there was never really a golden age, but returning to a kind of a place where bookstores were not ubiquitous, but you could really expect to find them in most every town, and that kind of way. But people are reading, again, the same kind of thing. There are lots of studies, and the government does, the National NEA and other entities have pretty much made it clear that people read less over time. But there are spurts, and the pandemic was very useful in that respect, that a lot of people refound their love of reading. And my kids read, so hopefully there are a lot of others that will follow them.
yeah.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about some of the reflections that you might have heard on curation and the idea of curation. I think indie bookstores have taken curation in a lot of different directions. Before I moved to Brooklyn, I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, another indie bookstore mecca, where there is a bookstore called 20 Stories, and they have 20 books of the month, and that's primarily what they sell. And so that's like the hyper curation model. Then you talked about the algorithms and the availability of countless books on the site like Amazon. And then there's somewhere kind of different, like a bookstore like Books Are Magic, that clearly is approaching curation with intentionality and care. But there's a kind of an interesting intersection with like the business side of it. So I guess the question distilled is like, what are some of the reflections on curation that the booksellers you encountered have to share?
Yeah, so just the question is about curation and how different indie booksellers approach it.
Yeah, the owner at Three Lives, Toby, likes to say there are 3 S's of bookselling. The space has to be beautiful and welcoming. The staff have to be smart. And the third is selection. And I think curation has never been more important because of the reasons that you mentioned and that we talked about before. People can feel understandably overwhelmed on Amazon. Some people can feel overwhelmed in the 18 miles of shelves at the Strand. And they're looking, I think a lot of people, why they enjoy going to indie bookstores is because they're looking for some direction, whether that's talking to a bookseller or even just expecting to browse books that have been picked by someone. And it's a harder task than ever because there are more books in print than ever. That you can find my book in this bookstore, is amazing. I mean, it's amazing to me. I'm so grateful and astounded because there's so many people with so much talent and so many books out there, and a relatively tiny, minute fraction you will ever hear of or come across. So Amazon can list them all, but how do we, find books? How do we learn about books? And booksellers make decisions every day that matter, and they have catalogs. They're now digital, and from all the publishers, large and small, and it's overwhelming to keep up with. And everything is a decision about, do I want to stock this book? Yes or no. And it's a personal decision at a bookshop. On Amazon, the answer is just yes to everything. We'll stock a copy and see if we sell it, and then we'll get another one.
Yeah.
I have a question that's about method. I love the book in that each chapter really dives into one illustration of one bookshop over time, and you do that throughout the book. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided who to interview, how you connected with people, and like what your method was for keeping track of those interviews? Did you record them? Did you take notes? Because you captured the people so beautifully, in addition to showing the history of those establishments.
Thanks. So the question was about method and how I structured the book. It was a tough thing to think about, how to tell the history of the American bookstore in 100,000 words, more or less, 406 pages if you're counting. And I thought originally of just a kind of chapter 1 starting in the colonial times and just progressing chronologically. But I really like getting into the weeds and the research and doing some, mini biographical sketches and having discussions with Amanda helped me think about a kind of series of portraits of bookstores that by themselves would illustrate different bookstore types, and sort of move also chronologically. And some of the decisions about which to include were really just based on sources. So some of these people, of course, are still alive, and I was lucky enough to interview, I mentioned Len Riggio, I interviewed Ann Patchett, I interviewed hundreds of booksellers that I just went into a bookstore and talked to, and usually I asked them if I could record it, and I just, some of them don't appear in the book, which I feel bad about, but I was looking for interesting stories and different kind of stories that told different stories about different kinds of bookstores, and deciding which ones to include was my own curation. That was honestly one of the hardest parts about the book, writing the book.
Thanks.
I know you talked a lot about like these archetypes of bookstores, but did you find there were archetypes of booksellers that you would meet through your interviews?
The question was about booksellers and are there different archetypes? Yeah, and there's a lot of booksellers embrace being eccentric. And maybe customers do as well. And I don't want to name names for people who are still alive. Sometimes I would interview people, booksellers, some of them very prominent. I was like, wow, this is a lot to sort of digest. And people had a lot to talk about. One guy who I just happened to meet at this shop called Word Up, which is way uptown, started by this woman, Veronica Liu. And I was just hanging out there interviewing her, and this guy walked in. And she was like, oh, you should talk to him. His name is Noble. And he had worked at Labyrinth in Princeton and the Strand and all these other stores. And he was like, I can't talk to you. And then he came over and he's like, all right, let me tell you about bookstores. And the first thing he said, which I quote in the book, is that bookstores are weird. And then, what he basically meant is that booksellers are weird. And his answer was that there's no real model or archetype, and that they are drawn to this profession because maybe they're a little kooky. And there are some interesting characters, and you asked earlier about, interviewing some of them, and some of them I wish I could interview that just are no longer alive, that I have some of them I have real admiration for and respect for, and some of them just seem really, would be just fun to hang out with for an afternoon. And again, the ones that I profiled were ones that I could find enough sources about, primary sources, where I feel like I could really understand them so that I could tell a story that had some color and meaning.
I think, yeah.
Could you tell us about one of those bookstores which you wanted to cover in the book but just didn't have enough information on?
Yeah, so the question is about what did I omit from the book that I had originally wanted to include. Well, my editor probably has no recollection of this, but in the proposal that I wrote that I promised to Viking, there was a chapter on college bookstores, and I spent a few days at Harvard, and they have this very famous, college bookstore, cooperative, and it was a fascinating, I thought, story, because the bookstore was sort of telling Harvard men how to be Harvard men, and part of that was what books they should read, but then they also sold, blazers and kind of other thing that went hand in hand with what it meant to be a gentleman. And I was just kind of really interested in how college bookstores have changed over time, and now they're oftentimes shells of what they once were, and mostly sell sweatshirts and stuff, and textbooks are for lots of good reasons, not in as many classrooms as they used to be. But I thought that was a kind of interesting story, but then I included some other bookstore, and I can't remember, but I made some decision that I thought there was a better story to include, and I didn't want the book to be too long, and I knew that there were going to be some serious omissions that would bother people, and I just sort of understood that from the beginning, that I can't write about everything.
We'll take two more. Yeah.
I'm curious, you talked a little bit about going to the library, looking at old things too. I'm curious, booksellers versus librarians, are they friends? Are they rivals?
Well, I think one of the consequences of bookstores becoming endangered is that booksellers have become much friendlier. So the old war between independents and Barnes and Nobles is hardly noticeable anymore, and the CEO of the American Booksellers Association is in regular contact with James Daunt, who's the CEO of Barnes and Noble, and they're on the same page about trying to limit Amazon's market share and trying to preserve brick and mortar bookstores so that the publishers don't fully orient their business entirely around Amazon and want brick and mortar bookstores to be healthy. So Barnes and Noble is an important part of that. And the same, I think, is true with libraries, where when libraries first became popularized in the late 19th century, the booksellers panicked and tried to oppose it. Many early bookstores had libraries, so subscription libraries, and Marshall Field's and other large bookstores, even into the mid-20th century, sometimes had subscription libraries where they would rent out books for a couple of pennies a day. But I think in modern times, people want to celebrate reading. Indie bookstores need all the support they can get, and you will more often see libraries and bookstores teaming up to bring in authors, to increase crowd size, to cross-promote events. So I think there's a lot of collaboration and cooperation and mutual respect.
Yeah, one last question right here.
I'm thinking back upon my teenage years. And there were 3 bookshops I'd go into in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in that area. One was Jackson, who could get angry and throw you out of the store. Another was Harry, who worked for the post office, but at night he opened his bookshop. He was the most interesting. And a fellow, Dave, whose store rose up 12 feet of books, and you had to be really a gymnast to get to the top and find books. There were times when I said, okay, I'll give you books at a quarter a piece if you'll climb and find them. They were all eccentric, and I can't see people like that surviving in this age. And I can see why the numbers were reduced, because these people knew nothing about marketing. They sat in their shop and they waited for customers to come in, and that was it.
Bookselling has always been a difficult, precarious, and low-profit business, and there were waves of bookstores that closed early on that some critics would have reason to say, well, it wasn't such a well-run bookstore anyway, or maybe it wasn't the greatest bookstore. So there are certainly many challenges in bookselling in the past and today, and many people still get into bookselling primarily not to make money, which was probably the case with the people you're talking about. So that remains an issue or a characteristic. But there are certainly eccentric, booksellers and owners. Emma Straub is an eccentric person, I think. I don't know her personally, but she seems so. And I think that can be in the right way embraced in a kind of warm, attractive quality instead of a cranky kind of curmudgeon-y, bookseller type.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Evan, for sharing this book with us. So just a couple quick reminders that Evan is going to be signing where my coworkers are pointing, right over there. And I'm going to take him right back so you can start signing. And then if you could pick up your belongings, that would be great. And if you are on the live stream, please click on the link in your description to buy a copy. And we also have more copies available at the front. So thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Thank you.
I'm going to take you right back.
Okay, I won't get stopped by anybody.